Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to another installment in our Reviewed and Ranked series. Today we will be covering a character who is one of my personal favorites, and this mischievous individual, though he calls Asgard his home, is not natively from there. Of course, that is Loki, the God of Mischief. And there's a lot to unpack about how he works in this particular game. And I, for one, have been enjoying the new series, which is available on Disney+. And so if you have the means to check that out, I would highly recommend that you do. But before we jump into how Loki works over here, make sure you check to see if you're subscribed to the channel. If you're not, go ahead and fix that, as that was greatly helped me out, as we are nearing the 900 subscriber mark and closing in as well on that 1,000 milestone, which hopefully we can hit within the next few months. If you enjoyed today's video and find it helpful and or interesting, make sure that you hit that like button. And without further ado, let's talk about Loki and his playstyle. So, to start, we do talk about his team build synergies that he has available. He only has 4 of them, and they're not the greatest synergies in the world, but they do help the overall survivability of a team. He has 2 vitality synergies with villains and gods and demons, 1 energy synergy with Marvel royalty, and 1 defense synergy with family values. So if you're looking to pad out and bolster the overall health of your team, of course, a good route to go is including Loki if you can line him up with other members in those 2 vitality type synergies. But if you're looking for a maximum synergy type team, there are certainly different builds that you can consider. That's no reason to write Loki off, because there are other elements of his kit that are quite helpful and enjoyable to use. Loki's standard attack sequence involves 4 different strikes with his staff or scepter, and as he wields that around, slashing out in front of him, he will trigger the opponents to become bantered and discourage grunt-type enemies from retaliating against him, which is always quite nice to see. The final strike of that hit is a forward-pushing lunge, and though it does have less of a range on the sides as some of the other attacks in this combo that precede it, it will send the opponents reeling backwards, again provided that they are not a mighty or mini-boss type character. Loki's heavy attack has a decent amount of range to it. It is an arc of energy that goes straight out away from the character. Smaller characters can get caught up in this and be kind of pulled back along with it, whereas it will move straight through the mighty and mini-boss type characters. But it still has a lot of application and can help Loki close out a couple of his opponents after they have been knocked further aback from him. So despite not holding your opponents close by finishing a standard combo, you still can get an additional hit by chaining one of those heavy attacks on it due to that extended range as it crawls out away from him. Upon pressing the jump button a second time while airborne will activate Loki's flight characteristic. This is also made evident with the glowing semblance that goes around Loki as he is flying around, as he does use his magic and sorcery to keep him airborne. And you do need to keep in mind with any other character that flies, Loki included, there will be a penalty to your energy points as it slowly and gradually is consumed while using that ability. So use it sparingly, and it doesn't really make the character move any faster. So if you're trying to use it for movement purposes, it's not the greatest option. But if you do want to use it to get around floor hazards and other rough terrain, that is certainly an application to which this fits quite well. Loki's falling aerial attack involves him plunging that scepter straight down into the ground, and of course the focal point of that strike is right around where he lands in the ground, and there is a shockwave area shortly around where he lands that will deal some damage to him, but the main focal point of this attack is in the direct vicinity of Loki as he comes down. Unfortunately, he does not have any abilities that prompt him into a follow-up using that falling aerial, and from what I see, it seems to put him in a quite lengthy recovery animation compared to the falling aerials of a lot of other characters we've looked at up until this point. So I don't really recommend using this, though there are opportunities and instances where you may find it an option that is usable. So use it sparingly and wisely when you do choose to utilize it. And then we have Loki's block and dodge animation, where he will form a brace out in front of him with that scepter in a diagonal stance, allowing him to mitigate damage coming directly towards him and holding those lashes further out away from his body. And as he dodges out of the way, instead of a standard roll, he will just kind of lunge in the direction that you move. And it's not the most graceful animation, but it does work for what Loki's character is. I think that it would have been a lot more fitting to see him kind of blink in and out of existence, because that is something that he can do and something that we see throughout a couple of the abilities, which we are just about to talk about. But I didn't animate the character. That's one thing that I probably would have done differently, but at the end of the day, it's just an aesthetic change, so I can understand why they may have shied away from doing so. Moving right along into the abilities that Loki possesses. The first ability is Dark Magic. And yes, magic in this instance is spelled M-A-G-I-C-K. Typically, you see it with the C, with the occasional uses of the K, but this one does have both letters included there. And this attack, it's not the strongest attack in Loki's arsenal in terms of dealing damage to stagger and powerful type enemies, but it does have the benefit of 3 separate orbs that will hunt down the opponents that are in the general vicinity. It will choose them at random, so you don't really get a lot of choice as to where they end up, but they deal a quite decent amount of damage as they do hone in on the opponents. And this attack does what it's meant to. It does come out a little bit slower, so it's not my personal first choice out of the abilities that Loki possesses, especially because there are abilities that he can chain together quite nicely. This attack has the ethereal attack type, which is an attack type that is not very common. The only other characters that we have seen this attack type on have been Doctor Strange and Scarlet Witch, which does make sense because the ethereal damage is understood to be from more of a magic type basis instead of other energy types present throughout the game. It has the burst synergy trait, and the attack itself has a very nice rating to standard damage with an A classification. It has a C classification to the energy points consumed, and as I mentioned before, it has that D classification to staggered damage dealt. And this particular ability benefits from a reduced energy point cost, an increase to the attack damage, an increase to the damage dealt to the stagger gauge, and a reduced chance of the attack being interrupted as the attack is ranked up. Loki's second ability is the Deep Freeze, and we do have the return of the shadow clones or the duplications of Loki that we saw with Dark Magic, and pretty much all of Loki's ability except for one. However, this one is not the exception to that rule. This will involve all 3 versions of Loki releasing frigid air upon the enemies out in front of where he is standing, and that is a very sizable hitbox and striking area as to where that strikes and takes place, and it is a very powerful attack in its own right. I really like using this one for a couple of different reasons. First of all is the damage capacity that it has, having that A classification to the damage that it does deal, and it maintains a C classification to the energy points consumed. Though it does possess an E classification to the stagger gauge, it does have the ability with the ice attribute to bypass the stagger gauge entirely, as it can freeze the opponent solid, which negates the usefulness of that stagger gauge and allows you to get a lot of very beneficial follow-ups to your opponents. So in these type of instances where it does render the opponent immobile or otherwise vulnerable to follow-up attacks, the stagger gauge rating is pretty negligible, all things considered. This attack still has that ethereal attack type and has the freeze synergy trait, And as this ability is ranked up, it has the benefit of a reduced energy point cost, an increase to the attack damage dealt. It will add the ice element to your ally attacks and have that reduced chance of the attack being interrupted. Loki's third ability is the Frost Illusion, and this is the lesser of the two ice abilities that are within Loki's kit. It does look quite nice, as there are those mirror images that return once again and cast freezing spells that rain ice shards down onto the ground out in front of the character, but that's where the drawback comes into play. Sure, as a whole, those areas might receive a decent amount of damage, but the individual ice shards are pretty low damage in their own right, and though this still has the ability attribute ice, I've never seen it freeze opponents, and you'd be hard-pressed to get it to do so reliably in comparison with the deep freeze ability and how consistently you can get characters and opponents frozen using that one. And the stats back up my hesitance with using this particular attack, as it has a D classification to damage and stagger damage dealt, although it does maintain that C classification to energy points consumed. This ability has the same rank up bonuses as the deep freeze, with that reduced energy point cost, the increased attack damage, the addition of ice elements to your ally attacks, and that reduced chance of the attack being interrupted. But once again, if you're going to pick between one of the two, the deep freeze does a lot better in a lot more wide of an area instead of two concentrated pockets out in front of the character. So if you're going to pick between the two, I would strongly encourage the deep freeze, but you may find instances where the Frost Illusion has at least decent utilization. Loki's fourth and final ability is the Mystic Vortex. This involves Loki waving and twirling his staff around himself for a few moments before a tornado is created and shot out into the area out in front of the character, which lasts for about a 7-second time span. And this attack, it's not great on its own. It deals pretty negligible damage with the F classification and has the C classification to that energy point consumption. It also does not have any damage rating to the stagger gauge. However, it does linger for a decent amount of time, and you can have opponents that are caught up in it. If you attack into that whirlwind while it is active, it can dissipate and throw and launch your opponents up into the air, rendering them vulnerable to additional follow-ups. And if you combo the Deep Freeze or Frost Illusion ability into the Mystic Vortex, it will take on the Ice attribute, which will boost its overall damage application. And it is notable that other characters such as Star-Lord and Crystal can throw their abilities into this area as well to charge that vortex with other elemental types, but you don't see that being used a whole lot depending on your team setup, and there are other characters that tend to use that vortex a little bit better. But in terms of the ice attributes that Loki possesses, he is, I would say, the second best of the ice users, and we will talk about the undisputed number one character when it comes to ice-themed damage in a future episode, and you probably already know who that is, but that's not the focal point of today's video. This attack has the energy attack type and the whirlwind synergy trait, and as it is ranked up, it has the benefit of a reduced energy point cost, an increase to the attack damage, an increase to the duration of the vortex, and finally that reduced chance of the attack being interrupted. And finally, we have Loki's extreme attack, and this one is on the quicker side of things. It fully expires in about a 5-second time span, almost 5 seconds exactly, as a matter of fact. And this attack involves 4 different illusions of Loki sending ice cascading into a center focal point, which is wherever Loki happens to be when the attack is initiated. And the area of effect is decently large, so you don't have to worry a whole lot about the placement of Loki. You don't have to be right on top of your opponents, but you will want to make sure that you are at least in the presence of the characters that you are wanting to strike. After those 4 illusions cast their ice into the center, there will be a large crystal that appears as Loki slams back down into the ground, and that's where the biggest portion of the damage from this attack takes place, though it does deal pretty consistent damage throughout that 5-second animation. Unfortunately, I have not ever seen an instance of this freezing opponents in place, or at least after the attack. It may render some opponents in that frozen state during the duration, but as Loki slams into the ground, it will break them out of that if they do happen to be frozen, but at the same time it deals some pretty large amounts of damage there as well. The one caution that I did have is what I've mentioned already, is you just need to make sure that you are located where you want to be. Otherwise, Loki's not going to really deal any damage to the opponents that you were meaning to hit with this attack. So it's now time for us to determine where Loki belongs on the character tier list. And I do feel like he is a decently powerful character, though again, he's just lacking in a lot of the categories that we were really hoping to see him shine in compared to the top tier characters in this game. And a lot of that does come down to a couple of his abilities just not quite having enough oomph to really muscle through some of the tougher segments of this fight. He is a very capable character though, and if you haven't played around with him, I would encourage you to do so. But that doesn't answer where we need to place him. He does fall outside of the S and A classifications, and he falls outside of the bottom portions of this tier list, which I do feel places him pretty comfortably into our B tier, which is getting quite large. And where do I feel that he belongs within this particular distribution? I think he just barely edges out Storm, and will take his place right here between Venom and Storm. Now, Venom just hits a lot harder with a lot of his abilities, and a lot of that does come down to the fact that, yes, he is a heavy tank type character, whereas Loki doesn't fit as much into that classification, so he is going to take a backseat in terms of overall damage output. But compared to some of Storm's elemental type abilities, Loki does have a slight edge with that, and I think one of the biggest components is the fact that Storm's Whirlwind is something that you have to manipulate and control as you're using it, whereas Loki's Vortex does allow him to chain other abilities into it, thus allowing for further damage amplification. So let's go ahead and move things around, and I actually think that because all of these characters are relatively slim, I don't need to worry about moving anyone down further onto that lower row of this tier. But what do you think? Do you think that I have overlooked anything with Loki? Do you think that I have talked him up too much or undersold him at all? Be sure to let me know what your thoughts are down in the comments below. And I am looking forward to next week's video where we cover another quite fun character. Thanks again for your time, and I hope that you have an absolutely fantastic rest of your day.